In the last section, we got a better idea of how to set and retrieve basic values stored inside of Redis. We're now going to move on and take a look at a slightly more complicated data structure, one that's going to ultimately be very useful for our caching project that we're working on right now. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a diagram. It's going to be a little bit crazy, but we'll go through it step by step. So this next data structure that we're going to look at is a nested hash. You can think of this as being like a nested JavaScript object. So at the top level, we still have a set of keys. But this time around, their values are not simple strings. Instead, the value that corresponds to this key of Spanish right here is its own nested object, or nested hash as we refer to it. So there is another set of keys inside of here. The key of red points to the value of rojo, which is a Spanish word for red. Orange points to naranja, which is the Spanish word for orange. And blue points to azul, which is Spanish word for blue. We can have multiple hashes like this stacked up inside of one instance of Redis. So Spanish points to its own nested object, and German right here points to its own nested object as well. To set values inside of a nested hash like this, we use a slightly different function. So before, we saw the set function. But to manage nested keys like this, we use set. The H here stands, you guessed it, for hash. So we're trying to set a value in a hash. A hash is another term for essentially the objects that you are used to working with JavaScript. The syntax here has three different arguments. The first argument is the overall key, like the master key that is managing this entire object. So Spanish here would point to the Spanish key right here. Red is modifying the key inside of that hash, and then rojo would be setting the actual value. So the first two arguments here are kind of like lookups of a sort. And then the third argument is the actual value that we want to set inside of that nested hash. To retrieve values, we use a similar syntax as well. Let me zoom in here so you can see it nice and easily. Okay, so we got hget right here. Again, hash get. The first argument is Spanish. We are specifying that we want to retrieve the value stored at red. So that would be rojo. And then again, the third argument is a callback function. It gets called with a value that is stored at the key of red. So eventually this would console log the value rojo. All right, now this diagram might not be making the most sense to you. So I do want to put this in different terms or show you a slightly different representation that might make a lot more sense. So we're going to first take a look at a little code snippet right here that represents the data that we set in the last video. Remember, we were setting a simple key of hi and a simple value of there. So if we put that data structure in terms of like a JavaScript object, everything stored inside of Redis would have looked like this right here. A simple key of hi with a simple value of there. So let's take this same kind of format right here and apply it to this idea of nested hashes. So if we took this kind of like language translation thing right here and wrote it out as a JavaScript object, it would look a little like this. So this overall object represents the entire data set of everything we have stored inside of Redis. Then inside of there, we have one key of Spanish and another key of German. Those both point at their own nested hashes or objects, and they both have their own set of keys and values. So red is rojo, orange naranja, blue azul. And German has its own set of like red, orange, and blue as well. Okay, hopefully this right here makes a little bit more sense in understanding exactly how this data is structured inside of Redis. Let's now change over to our terminal, and we're going to write out a little bit of code just to get some experience with working with nested hashes and retrieving values out of them. So I'm going to go back over to my terminal. If you have closed your terminal, remember you can get a client back up by running the command node inside of our project directory, requiring in Redis, defining the Redis URL, and then declaring a new client by calling redis.createClient and passing in the Redis URL. So that gives us this client object right here that we can use to manipulate Redis. All right, so let's give this a shot. Down at the bottom, or I guess top now because I'm going to clear out my log, I'll first set a new hash, and I'm going to try to set, let's say, how about German with red and rot, however you pronounce that in German. So let's try to set like this key and set a hash on it with red pointing to rot. So to do so, we would do client.hset. We would pass in the overall key space, which is German here. So this is like the overall master key. And then we're going to say that inside of German is going to be another object or a hash inside there. It should have, what do we say, red. So we're going to say red, and the value that corresponds to that would be rot, like so. And again, we get back true to say, cool, we did it, command executed. So now to retrieve a value out of here, we could write client.hget German red, and then again, I'm going to use that little trick with console log. So I'm going to write out console log, but I'm not going to put any parentheses after it. And so now you see that we have an error of null, and we retrieve the value rot, like so. Now, of course, we can add in as many properties as we wish to this German hash. So I could also add in, what is another one here? Blue with blah. So blue and blah, like so. And now we could, again, retrieve out blue from the nested hash at German. So client.hget German with blue. Oops, and I forgot the console log, my mistake. And there we go. So we retrieve a value out. Okay, so that's just another little data structure inside of Redis that's going to eventually end up being extremely useful for us. At this point, I think we've got a reasonable idea of how to store basic values inside of Redis and then later retrieve them out. So let's now take this idea of Redis and everything we've learned and figure out some way of caching data inside of Redis. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.